Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Cindy Hunt. I'm the Government and Legal Affairs Manager for the Department of Education. And with me today, I brought Laura Petschauer, who is the real expert on what we're going to be talking about today. So House Bill 2757 relates to giving accommodations for students who are deaf when they take the statewide assessment. So by way of background, the department for the past roughly 6 months or so has been engaging in a process of identifying in the statewide assessment system which subjects would be appropriate for giving an accommodation to students who are deaf. And what I mean by an accommodation, using American Sign Language as part of the assessment system. So for example, in assigning accommodation, for example, if the assessment is in mathematics, one of the issues with students who are deaf is that typically when they enter school, they can be as much as 4 grade levels behind in reading. And the reason for that often is because sometimes they're in a home environment where no one else signs. Sometimes they're not getting requisite services that they need. And it can be just a variety of reasons. So, for example, we find when students enter the Department of Education's Oregon School for the Deaf, they're typically, like I said, 4 grade levels behind in reading. So as we look at the statewide assessment and we look at certain subjects, for example, mathematics, we want the assessment to be of math, not of the student's reading ability. So as we started looking at subjects, we, like I said, identified mathematics and other subjects for this use of American Sign Language so that these students, like I said, would be tested in math specifically. But there's also issues when we started getting into the subjects about which ones would be appropriate and that kind of thing. And so a couple of the issues is that, and I see we have an American Sign Language interpreter, so I'll look to her to make sure I got it right. So when we go to use American Sign Language in the assessment, sometimes there's an interpretation issue. And what I mean by that is that sometimes the actual sign may be perceived as giving kids who are deaf an unfair advantage. And what I mean by that is, for example, the sign for fraction is like this. And so it looks kind of like a fraction. And sometimes there's a sign for like triangle, something like this, looking up there. And so one of the ways we did to address that is that we pulled together a group of sign language interpreters who are certified and also assessment experts to say, okay, what are going to be the guidelines for this? Because we want accuracy in American Sign Language, but we don't want to give the kids the answers. So that's one of the reasons that it's taking a couple of months to do this. And then so then where this effort is at is, like I said, for the last 6 months we've been working on this. The next step in this is that over the summer we're pulling together, like I said, the sign language interpreters to meet over the summer, and then it'll be rolled out in 2013-14. So then as we look at 2757 and how it fits into this, it would expand this to also include reading. So when we met with our Oregon accommodations panel that consists of universities, school districts, individuals with disabilities, parents of kids with disabilities, their recommendation is that reading should not be included as one of the subjects for which we would make the accommodation of American Sign Language. And basically the rationale there was they believed that, that even though folks or students who are deaf have significant challenges with reading, that they should still be held to the same standards as their peers when they graduate. Now, having said that, this is part of a much larger conversation. And I don't know if you remember me testifying a couple of weeks ago about the extended diploma and what we're doing there, is as we look at the diploma requirements and as we look at our state's graduation rate of 68%, we're reviewing things on every level to see, are there policies, are there guidelines, are there requirements that serve as a hindrance to students receiving the diploma versus what's appropriate. And so as we look at this and offer these accommodations to students who are deaf in some of the subjects, we identify this is appropriate, and then this will assist students in getting a diploma. So with that, we're open to questions, and Laura's here if you have specific questions about the process we used in our accommodations panel and that kind of thing.
And I have a question. I think when you've talked about it as an accommodation for a disability, that's one frame of looking at it. But if a student's primary language was Spanish, would they be allowed to take their reading assessment in Spanish?
Yeah, we have, I'm looking at our assessment. Yes. Yes, they would.
And I guess the follow-up to that is for a student, and I don't know American Sign Language, and I'm not deaf, but having had the opportunity to speak with those who are deaf, I've come to understand ASL not as a disability and accommodation issue, but as a first language issue. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if rather than allowing this to work on the reading, giving deaf students an unfair advantage towards getting a diploma, if not requiring them to be the only non-native English speaking group to be denied the ability to take their assessment in their first language, if we aren't creating this insurmountable barrier to graduating. And I think the evidence for that is, I understand we actually do have some kids who would have graduated, they had the credits, they had acceptance to four-year institutions and financial aid letters, and then because they couldn't pass that reading assessment in English, which wasn't their first language, a language they could never hear, they got a modified diploma, which meant they lost the opportunity to go to college and lost all access to financial aid. So I just, that's the genesis of the bill, and I wonder what it looks like if we shift it to a language issue rather than a disability issue.
And I would say it's both. It's a disability issue and a language issue. And because Laura, the accommodations panel talked a bit about this, correct?
Yes, the accommodations panel looked at kind of the current research related to the sign language interpreting, and with that they determined that when you're looking at reading, and I've done a little bit of research on this also, when you're looking at reading, ASL and English are very different, even with the construct of the sentences that are being, formulated. And so when you have interpreting provided during the reading, there's things that there's going to be words that aren't used, there's going to be expansions to explain possibly a word that is in text that needs to be articulated in sign. And so it's just very different from what the research that I've done is that it's not the same, it's not signing English, it's two different languages.
Yeah.
Thank you. Are there?
And so to add to that, so as I was speaking to our director at the School for the Deaf, for example, because many of these kids would be directly affected by this, I asked her about this. So I mentioned, that they come in with the four grade levels behind, and part of it is that the students who are deaf can learn to read. It's just a different process than us, and it's a harder process. I don't want to take away from that. So for example, when I was learning to read, it was a combination of hearing and sounding out words and memorization and other tools that I was using. Whereas a student who's deaf, it's they can't hear the words, they can't sound them out. So they have the other tools such as memorization and other tools that the School for the Deaf is using. And so some students who are deaf are definitely able to read and achieve the essential skill of reading and will graduate with a regular diploma. I didn't want anyone to walk away from this thinking that that wasn't the case. But it is going to be a struggle. And so what happens, for example, with the School for the Deaf is that those students who can meet the essential skill of reading, they will receive a regular diploma. But then for those students who cannot, most of them will receive a modified diploma, and that's what Representative Gelser was referring to, is with federal changes, they won't be eligible for financial aid and other forms of college and that kind of thing. And then, anyway, so I'll leave it with that. So it's both. It's a disability and a language issue.
Are there any other questions for there? Representative Reardon?
Chair, I'm not sure I understand how broadly this is applied to the students' learning. When you say assessment, what aspect? Is it right before graduation, or is it overall all years of their education?
And I would just clarify, the bill is intended, if it doesn't read that way, this is intended to get at that exit exam, at that OAKS that you have to get that standard diploma at the end. The bill would say that if a student whose primary language is ASL is not able to take that assessment in ASL, we wouldn't deny them a diploma because of that, if they met all the other requirements.
So the question, just to clarify, are you asking if the ASL is something that happens right before, the accommodation right before assessment or graduation, or?
Right. That's what I was asking, is whether it was right before graduation only. So are we translating, or we're revising one assessment, or are we talking about revising everything that the student is exposed to in their educational life?
So the answer would be then, the ASL accommodation or the signing accommodation would be available for all years of the Oaks statewide assessment. So beginning the first year throughout their last year of assessment.
So it's the Oaks, okay.
It's the Oaks, yes. And I had one other question on and I know we have a lot of people in several hearings. How many deaf people are on the accommodations panel?
Actually, I wanted to clarify, there's no deaf individual on there. There's an individual with a hearing impairment who also oversees our regional deaf and hard of hearing program and the interpreters in that region. So she is the one that we were referencing earlier, and she is not deaf.
Would there be room on the, I'm just given this issue and the language basis of the issue, might there be room for a person who is deaf to advise on the standards for deaf students?
Yes, the panel is not a closed panel, so if there's an individual who would be interested, then we can definitely have them come in to advise us.
Great. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you. Catherine Eckert-Mason and Colleen Thayer, please.
Hi, I'm Catherine Eckert-Mason, and I'm going to let Colleen introduce herself.
I'm Colleen Thayer, and I'm here with Kathy.
Right. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of this bill as I see it. And as Sarah was talking about, Representative Gelser was talking about, deaf students with ASL as their primary language being at a disadvantage and not having the same treatment as, say, somebody whose initial language is Spanish or Russian. You know, we're looking at it as more of a language issue versus a disability accommodation issue. And I wanted to mention just, you know, in my time, I have seen, last year especially, the impact of this. You know, it was mentioned, I saw about 4 persons last year who were accepted to college, had a Pell Grant, you know, being offered, and because of these issues, when all was said and done, the end of May, June, couldn't go to college. We had a heartbreaker of a year, and these were students that otherwise in previous years, you know, same level of language would have gone on and would have succeeded in college. So we've got a group of students, a year, 2 years worth of students that I know of, who have been kind of held in a holding pattern, are unable to access financial aid, unable to move forward with further post-secondary training. So in my mind, it's a language issue, it's an unfairness issue, and I guess that's where I'll leave it and let Colleen pick up.
Thank you.
I know there are 2 people here from ODE, and I thank them for coming. Now, they said they already have an assessment that's offered in Spanish. It's transliterated into that for Spanish speakers, and it changes the grammatical structure to Spanish when they do that. But why can't we do that from ASL to be able to take something in a test in ASL. And there's a 4-year lag of four-grade lag for most students that come into the school system that are deaf. They grow up with hearing parents and they don't learn sign language right off the bat, and people think that they enter school and they're ready to learn. But they get there at 4 or 5 years old, and that's when they start to get language. You know, if you have a hearing baby, that baby starts to pick up language, they're hearing speech, they're hearing people talk, they're learning the language as they grow, and then they get to school, they're ready to go. And many of the deaf students go into school for the first time, either mainstreamed or at a deaf school, and they start seeing sign language. And that becomes their primary language because that's what they're able to pick up. And so they need to gain that confidence in that first language before they can even start to pick up the English language. But they're already 4 grade levels behind. So the assessments expect them to be at grade level in English, but they haven't even started gaining their first language until they reach 4 or 5 years old. And, you know, we can blame the parents because they haven't offered any early intervention or anything like that. But we can't blame the students. It's not their fault that they're not passing the test. So, I mean, there's a different approach to language. And when you do early intervention, you have, if you're picking up ASL and English at the same time, you could do that. But most of our students don't even have that primary language when they start. So we're stuck in a situation where we have students, we have some here who've graduated last year or 2 years ago, but they have a modified diploma. And so their hopes of college, their dreams are gone. And so they're left with very limited options for the rest of their life. And who started them off? It was the parents. And I'm wondering how many parents are fluent in that language. You know, they get the child, they're hearing, and they have a deaf child, but there's no real clear advice or instruction as to what to do with a deaf child. And so they're trying to figure it out. But by the time they reach 8th grade, they're supposed to be equal to their hearing counterparts. And maybe if you give them 4 or 6 more years, they'll be able to catch up in that English. But during that time, they should be in college. And they should have more exposure to language before they get in there and allow them to get caught up in the English. And so my point is, I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy.
To add one more thing, and it is kind of a cost. It's kind of a cost factor thing. Is if you've got somebody who's bright, who's capable of succeeding, yes, maybe they're behind in some of their language, give them ASL accommodations, they go off to college, they succeed, they do well, they get a degree, you've got a tax-paying citizen here, and not somebody who's given up and said, oh, well, I'll stay home and I'll keep my SSI. And so that's, you know, bottom line, a pocketbook thing as well.
Thank you both very much. Are there questions for either of these individuals? No? Well, thank you very much. And I just want to thank both of you who are the individuals who raised this issue on behalf of the students who were not able to go to college because they were not able to take their assessment in ASL for reading. Representative Fagan.
I don't have a question, I just have a comment. I haven't spent a lot of time with folks who speak American Sign Language, and I just want to tell you, that was one of the coolest things I've ever seen, is just watching you speak your language. And I am somebody who is a very expressive person when I talk, and when I was watching you, I was thinking, if I was fluent in sign language, I think it would look a lot like you speaking, because you're so incredibly expressive. It's really a beautiful language, and I unfortunately have not spent a lot of time around people who speak American Sign Language, and now I want to, because that was an incredibly neat, you were very fun to listen to.
And really, I wish that you could say that to all the parents of deaf children. I wish they would all have the same attitude that you have, that the parents would get that attitude that you have.
Any other questions? Thank you both very much. We have one more person on this bill, Adelka Shan.